When institutions designed for impartial justice start acting more like political organizations, well, the very foundation of governance begins to shake. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Hi there. Today, we're digging into sources that investigate a pretty heavy claim: how the nation's justice and intelligence institutions became allegedly weaponized against political opposition.
Yeah, and our sources, they draw some pretty clear lines, starting from what they see as precedents set during the Obama-Biden administration.
Right through those really controversial early investigations surrounding the Trump administration.
So our mission today is to give you a comprehensive and, importantly, an impartial look at the arguments, the evidence presented in these sources concerning this idea of politicization in Washington.
Okay, so let's jump right in with the news hook. And this really comes from the investigation into the origins of the Russia probe, the Durham investigation.
Right, the one tasked specifically with looking into potential criminality and the targeting of the Trump campaign, that was its mandate.
Exactly. And what's really grabbed headlines from this probe is the core evidence of alleged institutional, well, fraud that emerged.
We're talking about the Kevin Clinesmith case.
Yes, the former FBI attorney. He actually pleaded guilty to altering an email about Carter Page, who was a Trump campaign aide at the time.
And Page had, it turns out, been a source for the CIA. Right.
Correct. But Clinesmith changed internal FBI documentation to state that Page was not a source for another government agency. That's a pretty significant alteration.
It is, because that single change had huge repercussions for the FISA process, didn't it?
Absolutely. The Justice Department apparently relied on Clinesmith's altered statement when he submitted the application, specifically the third and final renewal in 2017, to keep surveilling Page.
So basically to keep spying on him under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
That's right. And the institutional implication here, well, it's profound according to these sources. They argue this wasn't just some typo or technical mistake.
They see it as deliberate.
Yes, a deliberate omission of potentially exculpatory evidence that might have weakened the case for surveillance.
For the FBI to rely on a document allegedly falsified by one of its own lawyers to get a warrant renewal against an American citizen, especially someone linked to a political campaign.
It suggests a severe breakdown, doesn't it? A failure in the system that's supposed to protect civil liberties. It makes you question the whole foundation of that part of the investigation.
Okay, so let's unpack this a bit more. Let's look at how this idea of political bias allegedly seeped into the major investigations that came after those initial FISA warrants. Maybe start with the Mueller team.
Yeah, the special counsel investigation. Our sources really highlight what they see as an alarming lack of political balance on that team.
The numbers were pretty stark, weren't they?
According to the sources, yes. They claim that of the 17 attorneys Mueller brought on board to investigate President Trump, all 17 had allegedly donated money to Democrats.
All 17.
That's the claim. And critics argue this kind of overwhelming alignment, well, it created a strong perception right from the start that the investigation might be driven by political opposition, not just impartial fact-finding.
And that perception didn't exactly fade away, did it? I remember the Andrew Weissman situation.
Right, a lead attorney on the Mueller team. He agreed to host a virtual fundraiser for Joe Biden in 2020.
While the Mueller report was still being hotly debated.
Exactly. So it becomes, really difficult to argue for impartiality when key investigators are actively fundraising for the opposing political party.
Even Rod Rosenstein, the deputy AG who appointed Mueller, seemed to have second thoughts later.
He did. He later justified that he wished Mueller had picked a, quote, more politically diverse group. Hindsight, perhaps.
So the argument is the bias wasn't just perception, it affected the actual work, the targets, like Lieutenant General Michael Flynn.
Yes, Flynn's case is presented as a prime example. He was under an investigation for potential FERI violations, that's the Foreign Agents Registration Act, related to his consulting work.
But the key fact the sources point to is that the FBI had initially decided to close that investigation, right? Back in December 2016.
That's correct. The documents suggest they decided to close it because they, quote, could not substantiate the allegation.
Okay, but they didn't close it.
No. The sources allege that FBI leadership intervened specifically to keep the Flynn case open. Then you had Director Comey allegedly bypassing standard procedures.
By sending agents to interview Flynn directly in the White House in January 2017.
Right. And even after that interview, which later led to charges that Flynn lied to the FBI, some internal DOJ officials apparently didn't initially see Flynn's calls with the Russian ambassador as all that suspicious.
They thought it was normal transition stuff.
Sort of. Noting that such conversations were, quote, pretty common during a presidential transition. So the sequence presented is clear him, leadership intervenes, interview under questionable circumstances, then charges.
It looks, according to these sources, like targeting someone already cleared.
That's the narrative put forward.
Yeah.
And you really can't talk about these investigations without circling back to the Steele dossier.
Ah, yes, the dossier, central to those initial FISA requests on Carter Page.
Exactly. And the core allegation here is a failure of disclosure. The Obama-era DOJ and FBI used the dossier heavily, but allegedly didn't tell the FISA judges some crucial things.
Like who paid for it?
Right. That it was funded by the Clinton campaign and the DNC making it political opposition research. And also, critically, that it was largely unverified.
And didn't the FBI eventually cut ties with Steele himself because he was unreliable?
They did, yes. The sources point that out, claiming the FBI severed ties with Christopher Steele, but then continued to use his research to justify surveillance warrants.
Which sounds problematic.
To say the least. The sources argue this wasn't an oversight, but maybe an intentional collusion of silence to mislead the court, using political dirt as an intelligence tool, essentially.
Even when parts of the dossier seemed demonstrably false, like the Michael Cohen trip to Prague that never happened?
Well, the reporting on that was complex. Initial reports suggested it was a different Michael Cohen. But the sources note Mueller's team reportedly kept looking into it, tracing evidence Cohen might have entered the Czech Republic via Germany, possibly avoiding a passport stamp within the Schengen area.
But the central point remains, doesn't it? An unprecedented investigation was fueled, at least in part, by unreliable political opposition research.
That's the argument, yes, that this whole apparatus was sustained using questionable material.
So stepping back, the sources we're looking at argue that the groundwork for these kinds of aggressive political tactics, well, it might have been laid before the Trump administration even took office.
Exactly, which brings us to the alleged precedent set by the Obama-Biden Justice Department.
It's interesting because Attorney General William Barr under Trump faced intense criticism. But the sources claim Barr was attacked precisely because he was trying to, quote, expose the Obama-Biden abuses.
That's the counter-narrative presented. The core argument is that the Obama-Biden Justice Department allegedly, quote, weaponized its law enforcement apparatus against the campaign of Donald Trump.
Strong words. What examples do they point to?
Well, they often cite Attorney General Eric Holder's own description of himself as President Obama's wingman.
Right, I remember that.
Critics argue that kind of language immediately signals a shift, maybe away from impartial justice towards political loyalty, blurring the lines.
And this alleged politicization, it apparently led to direct conflict with Congress. The contempt vote against Holder.
Yes, that's a key event highlighted. After Holder repeatedly refused to comply with the House Oversight Committee's investigation into Operation Fast and Furious.
The gun-running scandal.
Right. The House took the pretty drastic step on June 28, 2012, of voting to hold Attorney General Holder in criminal contempt of Congress.
Which the sources frame as a serious disregard for constitutional checks and balances, basically saying the executive branch was operating without oversight.
That's the interpretation given. And then there's the issue of allegedly targeting the press.
The James Raisin case.
Yes, the Fox News reporter, back in 2013. The sources detail how the Obama-Biden DOJ tracked his movements using security badges, got a search warrant for his personal emails.
And even called him a co-conspirator in the warrant application, didn't they? All to find a suspected leaker.
Correct. That co-conspirator label applied to a journalist is highly unusual and controversial. Critics believe the whole leak investigation was just, quote, little more than pretext to seize Rosen's emails.
It sends a chilling message to journalists, potentially.
Holder himself later said the investigation could have been handled more sensitively. But the perception, for critics, was already set. Institutional overreach targeting the media.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now, moving into the Trump era, the sources argue that many of his administration's major actions were essentially attempts to push back against these perceived trends, to rebalance the system.
Exactly, like countermeasures designed to address what they saw as abuses from the previous years.
Let's start with executive clemency. The Roger Stone commutation drew a lot of fire.
It absolutely did. Critics saw it purely as Trump protecting a political ally.
But the DOJ itself, under Trump, had a different take on the original sentence recommended for Stone, right?
Yes. The DOJ pushed back, asserting that the initial 7 to 9 year recommendation for an obstruction case was, quote, extreme, excessive, and grossly disproportionate.
They compared it to sentences for violent crimes.
They did. They explicitly contrasted it with sentences for things like armed robbery. The argument was the punishment didn't fit the crime, regardless of Stone's connections.
And the sources also draw parallels to Democratic presidents' use of pardons, don't they?
Right. They stress that critics often, quote, ignore how Democrat presidents have used their pardon power, specifically citing President Bill Clinton pardoning his brother Roger for felony cocaine offenses.
So the argument is selective outrage, basically.
That's the claim, that the criticism of the Stone commutation wasn't based on consistent principle, but political opposition.
Okay, shifting gears to enforcement, specifically immigration. Congress wasn't acting, so the Trump administration took a much harder line.
A very decisive line, yes. Levying tariffs on Mexico, sending the military to the border, taking the gloves off, as the sources describe it.
And the Justice Department got involved legally, too, against sanctuary cities.
Yes, Attorney General Jeff Sessions initiated a federal lawsuit trying to strike down California's sanctuary policies.
Because the administration argued those policies put the entire nation at risk.
Correct. President Trump called them the best friend of the criminal. And the sources bring up statistics to underscore the enforcement challenge.
Like the Social Security number issue.
Yeah, pointing out that in 2017 alone, there were reportedly 1.2 million instances where undocumented immigrants filed tax returns using Social Security numbers potentially belonging to other people.
Which represents a huge number of possible identity theft cases.
Exactly. Cases the sources claim the IRS routinely ignores, highlighting this argument about selective enforcement of laws.
Finally, let's touch on regulations. The administration aimed for what it called regulatory sanity. The EPA's fuel efficiency standards, for example.
Right. EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt revisited the Obama-era CAFE standards. He concluded the targets set for 2022-2025 were unrealistic.
What was his reasoning?
He argued the previous standards would have eliminated an entire class of vehicle, likely trucks and larger SUVs, that hundreds of thousands of people rely on. So it's framed as applying economic realism against burdensome environmental rules.
And Congress also got involved with housing regulations.
Yes, they managed to gut a key part of an Obama-era HUD rule called affirmatively furthering fair housing.
What did that rule do?
Critics argued it allowed HUD, the federal housing agency, to essentially order over 1,200 cities and counties to change their local zoning laws based on income and race.
So defunding that is presented as pushing back against federal overreach into local control.
Precisely. Challenging the idea that Washington should dictate neighborhood zoning, which is typically a local issue.
Okay, so we've covered quite a bit of ground here, drawing from these sources. We've looked at the FISA abuse claims, the Flynn investigation, the Mueller team's composition.
Then trace the alleged precedent back to the Obama-Biden DOJ, looking at the Holder contempt situation and the targeting of journalists like James Rosen.
And then we examine the Trump administration's actions, clemency, border enforcement, regulatory changes framed by these sources as necessary responses.
Responses meant to counter perceived politicization and restore, in their view, impartial governance and economic sense.
So here's something for you, the listener, to really think about based on everything we've just discussed from these sources.
Yeah.
When you see documented evidence, like the Klein-Smith plea, and serious accusations that law enforcement and intelligence agencies might be taking political sides.
And when major investigations are then led by teams heavily weighted towards one political party.
It really forces you to confront a fundamental question, doesn't it? It goes beyond just who's in power. If the credibility of the legal system itself is repeatedly damaged by plausible claims of bias,
what steps actually need to be taken to rebuild public trust? How do we ensure that justice truly feels impartial and applies equally, whether you're a high-profile figure in Washington or just an average American citizen?